He was the biggest movie star in America. He was the highest-paid leading man in Hollywood, the heartthrob on every magazine cover, the cocky Florida kid who could outsmile any camera ever pointed at him. However, behind closed doors, one man absolutely despised him. One legendary actor, twice his size in fame and 10 times his size in ego, made it his personal mission to destroy Burt Reynolds' career from the shadows for over 40 straight years. He blocked him from 2 of the greatest films ever made. He insulted him on tape. He refused to ever stand on the same set with him. And the truly chilling part of this whole story? It all started with a single, harmless little television episode that aired one Thursday night in 1963, when Burt was a complete nobody nobody had ever heard of. The man who hated him was Marlon Brando. To understand how this poison started spreading, we have to go back to a sticky New York summer in 1962. Burt Reynolds was 26 years old, broke, and sleeping on a cousin's couch. His football career had ended on a Georgia highway when his car flipped and shattered his knee. His acting career, if you could even call it that, was a sad string of bit parts on shows nobody watched. He'd already quit one TV series after the lead actor refused to even speak to him for 7 straight weeks of production. Burt was hanging on by his fingernails, eating cheap diner food, wondering if he should just give up and go home to Florida. Then his phone rang one afternoon, and a casting director told him he'd been chosen for a small role on the 4th season of The Twilight Zone. The episode was called The Bard. On the surface, it sounded like a lucky break. However, the moment Burt arrived on the CBS soundstage, the producers pulled him into a quiet corner with a very strange request. They handed him the script and told him not to perform the role as written. They wanted him to do an impression instead, a very specific one. They wanted him to mock the most famous actor alive. So Burt agreed, and the cameras rolled. He played a washed-up Hollywood ham named Rocky Rhodes, and he played him with such dead-on accuracy that anyone watching at home would recognize the target in under a minute. He nailed the slouch, the muttered lines, the sweaty T-shirt, the sleepy stare. He hit that famous streetcar named Desire growl with surgical precision. He brushed the hair back, the same way the man brushed his hair back. The script even slipped in a sly wink, openly mentioning that Rocky Rhodes had once starred in A Streetcar Named Desire. The whole thing was a hit job in plain sight, broadcast to millions of American homes on the night of May 23, 1963. Critics destroyed the episode the next morning. To this day, The Bard still sits at the very bottom of nearly every Twilight Zone ranking list ever published. But somewhere in a quiet Hollywood mansion that May evening, one viewer was watching with his blood pressure rising, and he was about to spend the rest of his life trying to get even. Marlon Brando was 39 years old when The Bard aired, and according to multiple Hollywood biographers, he was already drowning in private fears. He could feel the weight piling on. He could see the hairline retreating in his bathroom mirror. He'd been hearing whispers around the studios for years, whispers about a charming young Florida kid who looked like a younger, prettier copy of him. He absolutely loathed the comparison. He felt his entire artistic identity was being copied without his permission by a man who had not earned the right to wear his face. So when he flicked on his television set that quiet Thursday night and saw a complete stranger reduce his life's work to a 5-minute punchline, something inside him snapped clean in half. Brando reportedly never spoke about the episode in public. However, close friends would later reveal that he kept a private mental list of grievances against Burt that grew darker and longer with every passing year. Burt himself eventually grew his trademark mustache in the early 1970s, partly to silence the comparisons forever. It would not work. The man on the other side of the country was already plotting his revenge. The years rolled on, and by 1971, the chess pieces were finally moving into place. Burt Reynolds was no longer a nobody. He was on the very edge of becoming the biggest leading man in America. Francis Ford Coppola was deep in casting for what nobody yet realized would become the greatest American film of all time. An obscure mafia project for Paramount Pictures based on a Mario Puzo novel called The Godfather. Coppola wanted a familiar face for the lead role of Michael Corleone, and Burt's name kept rising to the top of every shortlist on the table. The deal was almost sealed. The handshakes were almost done. Burt was being seriously considered for the single greatest acting role of the entire decade. However, there was one enormous problem nobody saw coming. Marlon Brando had already been signed to play Vito, the ice-cold patriarch of the family. And the moment Brando heard the whisper that Burt Reynolds might be cast as his on-screen son, he stormed straight into the producer's office and laid down a single, ice-cold ultimatum. If Reynolds got the part, Brando would walk off the picture and take his best actor performance straight out the door with him. Coppola immediately panicked, and the studio panicked right along with him. Brando was the entire emotional backbone of the film. There was no realistic way to recast a star of his caliber on short notice without blowing the production budget into orbit. Therefore, the producers did the only thing they could do. They quietly buried Burt's name and pretended the whole conversation had never happened. The role went to a stage actor nobody had ever heard of, a skinny unknown named Al Pacino. The Godfather went on to win Best Picture at the Oscars. It earned Brando his second Academy Award. It made Pacino a god overnight, and it redefined American cinema for the next half-century. Burt Reynolds eventually found out the truth about why he lost the role years later, through whispered industry back channels at a Hollywood restaurant, and he reportedly took the news with that famous Burt Reynolds shrug. He could have been Michael Corleone. He could have stood across from Brando in that legendary restaurant scene, the hospital scene, the final whispered moment in the garden. Instead, he made Smokey and the Bandit, which was a massive hit, sure. However, it was not The Godfather, and deep down, Burt knew the difference. He just smiled through it. You'd think one act of revenge would satisfy any man's ego, except it would not satisfy Brando. 8 long years later, Coppola was knee-deep in casting another epic, this one called Apocalypse Now. Brando had already been signed to play the haunting Colonel Kurtz, hidden deep in the jungles of the Philippines, and once again, Coppola began floating Burt Reynolds for a key role in the cast. By 1979, Burt was officially the highest-paid actor in Hollywood, with 3 of the top 10 box office hits of the entire decade behind him. He was a force of nature. None of that mattered to Brando. There's a leaked audio recording from the chaotic Apocalypse Now set, captured in real time, where Brando can be heard going off about Reynolds in language so vicious that it shocked even his own collaborators. According to the recording, Brando called Burt the epitome of something that makes me want to throw up, and added that Reynolds worships at the temple of his own narcissism. The producers immediately got the message. Burt's name was once again quietly erased from the cast list. 2 of the greatest American films of all time, both stolen from him by the same man, for the same forgotten parody from over a decade earlier. So why did Brando keep this rage burning for so long? The official explanation has always pointed back to that 1963 Twilight Zone parody. However, Hollywood insiders have long suspected something far darker was eating at him underneath. Burt was everything Brando feared becoming, and possibly everything Brando hated about his own younger self. Burt was leaner and quicker on his feet. Burt was charming on talk shows. Burt was beloved by middle America. Burt was effortlessly cool in a way the older man could no longer pull off in front of any camera. Brando, by the late 70s, had become reclusive, overweight, and notoriously impossible on every set he walked onto. Some say he saw Burt as a constant, painful mirror of the matinee idol he used to be, and could never be again. Others claim Brando simply could not tolerate being mocked, and Burt had committed that crime first, before anyone else ever dared to. Either way, the result was always the same. Brando treated Burt like a personal enemy until the day he died, and he never even gave him the courtesy of an explanation. Now this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Burt could have fired back at any point during those 4 decades. He had every reason in the world. The press would have eaten up a juicy public feud, especially one with a recluse like Marlon Brando. However, Burt mostly kept his cool. He played the long game. He let Brando do all the screaming, but Burt did slip in a few sharp little daggers when nobody saw them coming. In April of 1980, just months after losing the Apocalypse Now role, Burt finally got his shot at hosting Saturday Night Live for the first and only time in his life, and he took full advantage of every second of it. He performed a sketch where he played Marlon Brando lying flat on a hotel bed, being interviewed by Gilda Radner's beloved character Baba Wawa. The joke had Brando stuffing his face with food and refusing to answer a single coherent question. Audiences howled with laughter from start to finish. It was the second public parody Burt had aimed at his rival, and Brando reportedly heard about it within days, retreating even deeper into his bitter little world. But beyond a couple of comedy bits, Burt almost never went after Brando in the press. He never gave a tell-all interview. He never trashed him on a talk show. The closest he ever came was during a 2019 sit-down with Andy Cohen on Watch What Happens Live, just months before Burt himself passed away. When Cohen looked him dead in the eye and asked about the Brando feud, Burt smiled that famous Smokey and the Bandit smile and said he was very flattered. He was flattered Brando was upset. That was the entire answer. No anger, no bitterness, no scores to settle on his way out the door. Just a quiet, devastating little dig that landed harder than any insult ever could. Because Burt understood something Brando never figured out in his entire complicated life. Sometimes the cruelest revenge is letting the other man's hatred speak for itself. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004, at the age of 80. The two men never met in person, not even one single time during their entire shared lifetimes. They never appeared in a film together. They never even shared a real conversation across a table. Burt outlived his rival by 14 full years before passing away himself in September of 2018 at the age of 82. According to those closest to him, Burt never publicly held a grudge against Brando, even at the very end. He told biographers with a hint of sad admiration that he respected Brando's talent more than anyone realized, and friends say he kept a worn copy of On the Waterfront on the shelf of his Florida home library right up until his final days. The hatred only ever flowed in one direction, and that, in the end, may have been the cruelest twist of this entire story. Burt Reynolds spent more than 4 decades being despised by a man he had always admired from afar, all because of one 5-minute parody he'd filmed on a forgotten television set in 1963 when he was barely making rent and praying for his next paycheck. Looking back, the saddest part of this whole feud is what we, as the audience, lost in the cold silence between these two men. Think about The Godfather with Burt Reynolds standing in for Al Pacino, going toe-to-toe with Marlon Brando in that infamous restaurant scene, that famous hospital scene, that final whispered moment in the garden where the empire passes from father to son. Think about Apocalypse Now, with Burt sweating through the jungle to face Brando's terrifying Colonel Kurtz under that flickering light. Think about the chemistry, the tension, the cinema we'll never get to see now. Two leading men of two very different American eras, locked in a real artistic standoff under Coppola's direction. We'll never know what could have been. Marlon Brando made absolutely sure of that, and he did it with the cold precision of a man who never forgets a slight, no matter how small. And Burt Reynolds, to his enormous credit, never let any of it break his spirit. He went on to a long, complicated, brilliant career filled with hits, misses, marriages, divorces, and the kind of self-deprecating Florida charm no other star of his generation could ever quite match. The man rode the highs, took the punches, lost roles to grudges he never started, and somehow always walked away from the wreckage smiling. Marlon Brando got the better of him on paper, in the trade magazines, and in the casting offices of Hollywood for over 40 long years. However, in the end, when the dust of all those wasted decades finally settled, Burt Reynolds is the one we remember as the gentleman of the two.